Alright, so this is video 2. You should have already watched the first 15-minute video on Vietnam. This is part 2. We left off on the slide. Alright, so Operation Rolling Thunder, we had that conversation about how we just felt, okay, we're the United States. We are more technologically advanced than Vietnam. Let's just bomb them. Bomb, 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 bomb. Problem is that, okay, use the bombs, but problem 1, they're hiding underground. Problem 2, you're destroying lots of their land. It's not your country, your land you're destroying somebody else's. So you're going into their country, trying to help them fight against communists, saying that democracy is better than communism. But how are you really helping them when you're bombing their country, you're bombing their lands, you're bombing their homes? So really, this whole campaign was counterintuitive. Although it went in with a clear objective, it didn't really pan out the way they thought it was going to pan out. All right, so kind of going a little further into that, Richard Nixon, again, by 1968, guys, again, we're going to go much more in detail with this next year in the U.S., so I'm kind of giving you guys cliff-noted versions of this, just for the purposes of kind of what you need to know. So by 1968, Vietnam was a disaster. American death total started rising dramatically. At this point, we had close to 500,000 soldiers over in Vietnam. And going back to what I said in the first video, World War II was much different from this kind of war. You had this movement going on at home. You had civil rights movements. You had feminist movement. You had the Latino movement going on. You had the hippie generation, and you had the anti-war movement going on too. So a lot of things are going on at home. But ultimately, Lyndon B. Johnson decided to not run for another term. His popularity is very, very low. Vietnam basically ruined his legacy as a president. So Richard Nixon, he campaigned in 1968, bringing back law and order and ending the war in Vietnam. He promises that he's going to withdraw troops from Vietnam at some point, start withdrawing them slowly but surely, which was a very popular thing amongst most Americans at this time. This policy was called Vietnamization. Highlight it, circle it in your guys' notes. The term you need to know: Richard Nixon, Vietnamization, start slowly bringing home the troops back home. So we wanted to start handing over more control to South Vietnam. Start having them kind of, fight for themselves instead of being so reliant on us. However, something happens that's going to cause a lot more controversy for Richard Nixon. So here's the problem. The Viet Cong were moving soldiers from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. They were bringing in supplies, soldiers, weapons, ammo. We're like, how are they getting all these things? How are they able to supply all these things in South Vietnam? Well, there was something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Think back to Ho Chi Minh, I said in the first video. There was this trail that went through the jungle. And thousands and thousands of North Vietnamese were funneling weapons into the Viet Cong to supply them, to fight against Americans and the South Vietnamese government. So the problem is that a part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail goes into Laos and Cambodia, 2 new countries. So we start bombing Laos and Cambodia where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is. Well, when Richard Nixon goes on TV and explains to the American people that now we're bombing Laos and Cambodia, the reasons don't matter. People just hear we're bombing 2 new countries. We're expanding the war, not decreasing it. We're expanding it. And people go ballistic. So that's when Kent State shootings are going to happen today. On May 4th, we just passed that, May 4th. This year's the 50-year anniversary of the shootings at Kent State where 4 students were shot. But that was in retaliation to this announcement by Nixon. So on March 18th, 1969, Americans are going to start carpet bombing Cambodia, Laos. 540,000 tons of bombs are going to be used. Civilian casualties were between 150,000 to 500,000. Civilians were killed through these bombing campaigns. And at first, on March 18th, all these bombings were kept secret from American people. And now this video you guys see, this picture you guys see up here, that was Nixon about a week and a half later, that will finally come to light and will finally explain, what these were. But at first, all this was secret. All right, so again, fast forwarding. Finally, by March '73, the last of the U.S. troops are going to leave Vietnam. shortly after the Americans leave, the North Vietnamese are going to attack South Vietnam about 2 years later, and they're going to they're going to defeat South Vietnam and create one country again. It would just be Vietnam, but it'll be communist controlled. So really, again, our policy, again, our objectives. So some people claim, America, we don't lose, but you can definitely argue that Vietnam was an American loss. I mean, our objective was to stop communism. We didn't stop communism; it spread. South Vietnam will eventually become communist. We were going to leave without really the objective being met. Um, so, so really, that's it for Vietnam. So, fall of Saigon. North Vietnamese troops march into South Vietnam. The communists renamed Saigon into Ho Chi Minh City. So results. There were 58,000 Americans who were killed in Vietnam. 400,000 South Vietnamese were killed, and over 900,000 Viet Cong were killed. So this is where you kind of have to kind of separate kind of what you're used to seeing in battles. You could say, well, America won because look at the numbers here: 58,000 Americans died compared to 900,000, almost a million Viet Cong. So that totals, we won. Oh, I guess you could have that view of it, but a big part of war is also objective. Were we successful? That's where it's questionable. We pulled out for all those problems that we were having. Over 304,000 American troops were injured, wounded because of the war. PTSD became a big problem. Veterans, when they came home from the war, weren't really respected because Vietnam was a war that was, again, very controversial. So how we treated our veterans and some of our veteran treatments became to be put under the microscope for that. And then finally, so after Vietnam, we refused to recognize the Vietnamese government as being legitimate because they were communists. So it won't be until 1989 where we'll finally recognize Vietnam as being a legitimate, recognizable country where we're going to recognize their government, their diplomats, ambassadors, etc. Vietnam still remains a United Nations communist to this very day, and eventually Cambodia and Laos, we were fearful of this. Cambodia and Laos will both fall to communism as well. That whole domino effect. All right, so that's it as far as that goes. Now I'm going to go to wrap it up, the last part of the Cold War. Excuse me. Pardon me. All right, got plenty of time. Okay. All right, hold on, Mick. I got to end the video here. My son's crying. All right, sorry. Bye. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that brief delay with the kids. All right, so kind of going back a little bit with now finishing up the kind of Cold War aspect of it. We left up, I believe, here where Richard Nixon, again, going back to Richard Nixon again, with the Vietnamization, kind of tying that all in. We talked about this last time with how Nixon was the first president to visit China to start to fix relations. So although China was our enemy for the 50s and 60s, because again, think about that. China was helping North Korea fight against the Korean War. China helped the North Vietnamese fight against us in the Vietnam War. So there were some tensions there, obviously, but Richard Nixon knew it was in his best interest and America's best interest to try and mend relations with them. Why? Because there's 1 billion Chinese people, consumers, buy American products. So although we didn't agree with their government, we didn't like them very much, he wanted to try and mend relations with them as best we could, is have a business relationship, to open up the borders, start trade, etc. That's good for American business. All right, so slow thaw. As I mentioned, you guys, think of the Cold War as in two eras. You had the 40s, 50s, and 60s era, very chaotic, very tense, close to nuclear war. 70s and 80s were, think of the slow thaws. They have it in the title here. Slow thaw. Thaw means like things are starting to kind of melt. Things are kind of getting better now. So in 1969, Nixon is going to make an agreement with the Soviet Union called the SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Agreement. So that's what SALT stands for. Vocabulary term, you know that. So jot it down. So what does that mean? Basically means that we're going to freeze the making of nuclear weapons. We're going to decrease nuclear weapons now. Think how big that is. 40s, 50s, and 60s, we're increasing nuclear weapons. Now we're decreasing it. Again, it's in America's best interest to start having somewhat better relations with the Soviet Union and China. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a big part of this, guys. We both realized both countries don't want to go to nuclear war. So kind of keep that in mind. It was the first effort between the two countries to stop increasing of the weapons, so that's big. So big. That's really the big point there. And then in 1978, the Soviet Union is going to invade Afghanistan. Guys, this is going to be the Soviet version of Vietnam. The Soviet Union, big bad country, going to little tiny Afghanistan, who's nowhere near to the same level of economic power, military power, technological power. On paper, the Soviet Union should have destroyed Afghanistan. But Afghanistan had a very similar landscape than Vietnam did. It was very mountainous, lots of places for the hide. Afghanistan's going to use guerrilla tactics. You can't really see the enemy. Soviet Union is going to get bogged down in basically a 10-year war, guys. Billions of dollars spent, lots of life lost, in a country on paper they thought they were going to win and destroy. So again, it became the Soviet Union's version of Vietnam, a long war with no clear victory possible, many casualties, high costs. The U.S. is going to support the Afghani rebels known as the Mujahideen. So, guys, back in the 80s, we were helping out the Mujahideen. A name you might sound familiar to you guys, Osama bin Laden. A lot of those fighters that are going to be used 20 years later against us with the war on terrorism was going to be used, here. A lot of those foundational pieces. So we supply them with American weapons and American support. So finally, in 1989, the Soviets are going to withdraw from Afghanistan. Islamic extremists use this opportunity to take over the country. This defeat is going to weaken the Soviet economy, and eventually this will basically be the end of the line for the Soviet Union. Communism is going to fail, and really started with this. 1980s, you have, throughout the Afghanistan war, Ronald Reagan will become American president, two-term Republican president, who's a former actor. He planned to renew those tensions with the Soviet Union and outspend the Soviets. He knew the Soviets were going to be in big trouble with fighting this Afghanistan war. So our goal was to start outspending them, start to increase escalations with them, knowing they probably couldn't keep up. Essentially, the goal was to basically bleed them dry, bankrupt them. So we developed this Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as SDI, also known as the Star Wars Plan. Basically, it was an idea that he wanted to start looking into to protect the U.S. from nuclear attack by putting satellites in outer space, having lasers on them, and if a country were to attack us with nuclear missile, these lasers up in outer space can shoot them down. So they called it the Star Wars Plan. Hence, Star Wars came out also back in the 80s as well. So the criticism of this plan is going to cost billions of dollars. And then obviously you're restarting tensions again with the Soviet Union, where back in the 70s it was relatively peaceful. Mikhail Gorbachev will become the president of the Soviet Union. He was much more concerned about saving the Soviet Union than winning the Cold War. Again, by the 80s, the economy of the Soviet Union was not doing so good. There became movements in the Soviet Union for different freedoms that they never received before. So he had all those movements back at home too to deal with. So some reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev is going to pass, something called glasnost. This means openness. So these policies will start allowing more freedom of speech, and etc. that he's going to institute throughout the Soviet Union. And then perestroika. This was a restructuring of the economy. He's going to increase trade and decrease in military spending. So take money away from the military. Think how big that was. 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, they're increasing the military. Now they're going to decrease to save on money to spend for all these social programs, fixing poverty and economic things too. And he's ultimately going to end the nuclear arms race. So finally, leading into 1989, where the Berlin Wall is going to come tumbling down. You see these pictures down here, very famous events. You can go ahead and read this, but eventually communism is going to fail. A big movement in the Soviet Union and in Berlin where the Berlin Wall is going to collapse, meaning the Soviet Union is going to collapse, and that was basically the end of the Cold War. And that is all for today. So sorry for the two videos, both long. That's going to be a majority of your assignment for this week. So anyway, you'll see that all for this week's assignment. All right, adios, have a good one.